Davis steps under center. Gibson and McClendon behind him. Davis with motion by Richard. Will give the ball to McClendon. He leaps. Oh, he doesn't get in. He fumbled the football. Carolina holds. The game is over. And Carolina has won the game.
Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Wolford again. Wolford the other way. At the 30, the 40. Wolford to midfield. Miles Wolford with the pick. The heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory.
Left side of the line. Hood standing to Williams' right. Williams gonna throw. One-on-one. Davis has it. Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
Connor Barth for the possible win. Snap, spot, kick away, high enough, long enough. It's good! It's good! Carolina has won the game on a 42-yard field goal by freshman Connor Barth. Good gosh, dirty.
This is the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. Big Heads Media Podcast.
Hey guys, and welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It is the final podcast of the decade. That's right, the final podcast of the 2010s decade, and then we will move on, of course, to 2020, which will be one of the more exciting years in Carolina football. But on today's show, we are not going to talk just exclusively about the 2019 Tar Heels. We're going to wait and do our postseason awards, as well as look back at who we picked as our standouts before the season. We're going to do that in a couple of days. Right now, we're on here, and we're going to talk about our all-decade teams for the Tar Heels from the 2010 season through the 2019 season. So basically how we did it is it's pretty much your typical all-ACC type format. There might be a couple of changes, but basically one quarterback, two running backs, three wide receivers, a tight end, 5 offensive linemen, 4 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, 3 defensive backs, and then we'll do special teams as well. I went a little more in depth with some of the stuff on the article than we'll go in depth here on the show. But we'll really just kind of touch on each of the positions. Some we'll talk about a little bit more than others, really the ones that can be debated a little bit more. There are some that are pretty obvious that we'll just roll with and let you guys kind of figure out your own team along the way as well. It's a little bit different than how we did the basketball one, because basketball you only have a starting 5, but I got Josh Marlowe along with me that'll help me break this down along the way. So, buddy, one of those decades for Carolina football, not quite the most successful decade for the Tar Heels, but still one that produced some interesting results and some really good players that we can look back on and have some fond memories of.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think, you had 3 different head coaches in this decade: Everett Withers, Larry Fedora, Mac Brown, and
Butch Davis as well in 2010.
So you had
yes,
4.
yes.
So four head coaches over 10 years, and it was a roller coaster, I think, is the best way to describe what we went through starting in 2010, what we ended up through with Larry Fedora, and now where we are again now with Mac Brown back in Chapel Hill. But the good thing was that we always had guys on Saturdays that were a lot of fun to watch, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is some of the great guys that we got to watch. And for us, this is really where our Tar Heel football fandom kind of grew, was
Right.
starting in this decade, and now, of course, we're writing blogs, doing podcasts, going to games.
It's true. It is true. Yeah, we were just little nerds that were watching games for the longest time while mixing in some video game playing on Saturdays. Now we're literally sitting there with our computers waiting for the games to happen so then we can write recap articles, stock reports, trench reports, other team news. Yeah, that's it's pretty bad when we're looking forward to that kind of stuff. But this is the field that we love to be in. So these types of articles are always the fun ones to do, and it's just the start of the offseason, so we're going to have a lot more of these types of articles coming up. But this one, I think, fell at a really good time as well, right after the season, and really produces some really good discussion. So we'll start on the offensive side of the ball, and, of course, we'll talk about the most important position on the field. That is quarterback, and I feel like this one probably pretty obvious just based on all of the statistics, the fact that the guy that we went with played more than 1 year at quarterback. I think the most obvious answer here is Marquise Williams. You can make the argument talent-wise for Mitch Trubisky, for Sam Howell, but you look at Marquise Williams, a guy that threw for nearly 8,000 yards, 61 touchdowns in his career, and is the only Tar Heel quarterback, only player in Tar Heel history to go over 10,000 yards of total offense. This one seems pretty obvious, and, he's one of those guys that is also up there when you want to talk about the program's great all-time quarterback. So this one was pretty easy for me.
Yeah, this is a guy that, put up a lot of production and yardage. He's also the quarterback that took Carolina to the first ever ACC championship game and was the quarterback that went toe-to-toe with Deshaun Watson here in Charlotte. And it was a rocky start for him. I remember when we landed him as a recruit, this was a guy that was raved about in that recruiting class. And then, of course, he left Carolina, and then he re-enrolled back, and I guess was his redshirt sophomore or junior year. And Brent Renner got hurt. He kind of stepped in, sparked that team. And, it always seemed like whenever he played, even though he wasn't the most efficient passer, he always felt like he gave you a chance because he was going to make enough plays with his arm. He could make up for the lack of arm production with his legs, and was really a lot of fun to watch. And that 2015 season, you take away the opener against South Carolina, he was almost flawless, leading that team to an 11-1 record. And look, Trubisky had a great 1 year. Sam Howell had a fantastic 1 year. We got to see Keys for about 3.
Right, and that's the reason why. Yeah, about 2.5. I think coming in for Renner after he got injured in his final game against NC State of his senior year. Of course, that game was mid-season, but he was ruled out for the year. Then Keys comes in, puts them on a 4-game winning streak, I believe it was. Might have been 5. I think one of the two, 4 or 5 game winning streak before, of course, they eventually got beat in the regular season finale against Duke, and then ends up going into the bowl game against Cincinnati and pulls out the win. So, this was a guy that, when you talk about that 2015 season, he was what drew that entire offense. You look back and everybody wants to talk about guys like Matt Collins, Ryan Switzer, Elijah Hood, who had a huge year that year as well. You look at what Marquise Williams did. He wasn't in the Heisman race, and probably rightfully so, but this is still a guy that almost ran for 1,000 yards that year, along with what he did through the air. So, yeah, there's a legitimate, battle here when you want to talk about talent between him, Sam Howell, and Mitch Trubisky. But I think, because of how much more he played than the other two guys, you got to go with Marquise Williams here. And then you go to running back. This one, again, pretty easy, I think. It's Gio and Elijah Hood. I think, there might be some argument if Michael Carter ends up finishing his career pretty well, that Michael Carter could be in there. But again, we're just taking the stats from this decade. So, you look, Gio, a no-brainer, was only active for 2 seasons. Of course, redshirted his first year on campus, and both of those seasons saw him over 1,500 yards of total offense and reach double-digit touchdowns, 14 touchdowns and 17 touchdowns, respectively, in his 2 seasons on campus. He finished his 2 seasons seasons with 2,481 rushing yards, 852 receiving yards, and 31 touchdowns. Really just a do-it-all type of guy in his time in Chapel Hill. And then for Elijah Hood, kind of had some ebbs and flows throughout his career. Didn't finish his career quite as well as maybe some had hoped after a phenomenal 2015 season, but still posted back-to-back seasons with over 1,000 yards, including the 2015 season where he ran for 1,463 yards and 17 touchdowns. That rushing yards number second all-time behind only Don McCauley, and also those were the third most rushing touchdowns in program history. He actually finished his career with more rushing yards than Gio, with 2,580 rushing yards and 29 touchdowns. But, of course, remember that Gio did hit in just 2 years while Elijah Hood was there for all 4 years of his career. So these two seem like real no-brainers to me. I mean, TJ Logan is the guy that I had as my first second-team guy. But, I mean, when you look at these guys, they were just a little bit of a step above everybody else and were part of what was, a pretty decent crop of running backs here during this decade for Carolina.
Yeah, it would have been crazy to see the numbers Gio puts up if he stays. Can
you imagine him in this year's offense?
Yeah, well, think about that offense that if he would have stayed in that second year for Larry Fedora. You remember when that season ended, Carolina, of course, was 7-6 under Larry Fedora their first year. No, 8-4 was their first year.
Right. Didn't go to a bowl game because of the bowl ban. Yep.
Gio Bernard was being talked about as a sleeper for the Heisman Trophy next year because of the production that he had already put up and what they expected him to put up in the next year of Larry Fedora's offense. This is a guy that, I mean, even the first year when they were running just the old school line up in the eye and just run the ball, he was still producing. So really was robbed of him. You talked about playing video games. That was a guy that first year we had the spread offense. I was like, this is a lot of fun.
Right.
Then Elijah Hood, I mean, he was a guy that came in, heralded recruit, right here out of Charlotte Catholic. He had the big year in 2015. His junior year, he wasn't as great. But we kind of learned after he decided to leave for the NFL, he wasn't always healthy and was struggling with, I think it was asthma issues, but he couldn't always have his full breath. But, man, when he was on, he was a tough runner in the ACC, racked up a lot of yards after contact, was a really hard runner. TJ Logan's interesting because he was a little bit of a do-it-all kind of back. He was active in the pass game, could run the ball. He had some points in that 16 year. He was our best runner and, of course, was a threat in the return game. But I would still probably lean Elijah Hood because 2015 success doesn't happen without him running for those 1,400 yards.
Oh, definitely. And, I mean, the thing for TJ Logan, he always seemed to be that guy that was number 2 on the depth chart. He could just never seem to climb into that role as the number 1 guy, but was still so efficient out of that number 2 running back role, that rotational back role, that he had to be talked about. When you go to wide receiver, again, this is another one. The offensive side of the ball really is pretty easy. You got to go with outside wide receivers. I went with Quinshad Davis, of course, career touchdown leader at Carolina with 25 in his career, all of which came in the decade. You got Dwight Jones. Now, Dwight Jones' career did begin in 2009, but his 2 most productive seasons came in his final 2 years, which were at the start of the decade. So you have to put him on the list. And then Ryan Switzer, of course, the guy that leads Carolina all-time in receptions and receiving yards. You have to put him on the list in the slot. I mean, out of those 3 guys, I mean, I just don't feel like there's much more that you can debate. Maybe Mac Hollins just because of how good of a deep pass catcher he was. But, I mean, I don't know who you're taking off that list if you're going to put him on there. I still lean Dwight Jones because Dwight Jones is one of those guys that really wasn't flashy, but when you go back and look at his numbers and you think about it, you say to yourself, I can kind of see that because he pretty much caught everything and then had to do it after Hakeem Nicks left campus.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are the 3 clear-cut answers. You think of Quinshad Davis. We don't think about the catch at Virginia Tech that clinched the ACC Coastal title for us in 2015. Dwight Jones, was kind of that was right when we were first coming into Carolina football. I mean, we'd watched it growing up, but when we saw, Hakeem Nicks, but that was a guy, like you said, I mean, he was Carolina's pass threat, and that was it.
Yes.
And the kind of offense that they ran at the time, it was, well, we're going to throw the ball to 83, and he's going to make a play. And Switzer, we could talk about Switzer for hours. That was our favorite Tar Heel.
Right.
As a freshman, just a guy that worked his tail off to break all those records because he wasn't a highly thought of recruit. But by the time as a senior was Mitch Trubisky's go-to guy, especially on 3rd and 4th downs.
Right.
Was able to get over the middle of the field. I mean, those are the three guys. And if De'Ami Brown was maybe a junior, you maybe put him in there because of the kind of year he's had this year. But we've only got 2 years of him putting up numbers. So.
Right. I actually have him as because I went in depth enough to do a 2nd and 3rd team. I actually have him on the 3rd team because I went with Mac Hollins and Bug Howard over him, really because De'Ami just has the 1 year of production. That's the biggest issue was the first year on campus, they didn't really – I mean, Larry Fedora's offense wasn't able to use him the same way that Phil Longo's offense was able to.
Larry Fedora wasn't smart enough to use him as Phil Longo. We're just saying something.
Here we go.
Because Buzzcut's offense hasn't always been the smartest.
My God. Just leaving it all out on the table today. But yeah, no, I mean, you talked about Switzer, just dominant, a guy that just, everybody's going to remember him as a punt returner. I mean, he, by his junior year, he was the go-to guy in the slot. And there was legitimate thought when he went to the NFL that this guy could be a guy that lasted a while in the NFL at slot receiver. That hasn't really panned out just yet. There's still time possibly, but, this was a guy, he was that dominant towards the end. The game that I think everybody can look back at if you really need is that Pittsburgh game where he just, if it was thrown in his direction, he found a way to haul it in and make the catch. So him and Quinshot's another one of those guys that, we knew he was going to be special because remember when he came in his true freshman season, he was a guy that worked his way into the rotation immediately, and we were like, oh, okay, this is not, a guy out of Gaffney, South Carolina, who was a 4-star, but many were still expecting, okay, it's going to take him a little while to sort of get himself into the flow of things. All of a sudden, we have this other guy, this guy out here catching passes left and right in the end zone, and we're like, okay, I guess we got to take notice of him. Finished with 25 receiving touchdowns, and again, not a guy that is, super flashy, like Switzer or like Mac Hollins, who did it with all the deep catches, but still a guy that was just really, really solid. And Dwight Jones, as we said, just kind of the do-it-all guy. When you go down to tight end, this is the most obvious one on this list. Look, Eric Ebron was as dominant as any tight end has ever been at Carolina. Had the 4th most receiving yards of anybody in the decade. That includes all wide receivers and tight ends, and set school records for receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns by a tight end. A mark, the latter mark that was later broken by Brandon Fritz, who Ebron finished with 8 touchdowns in his career. Fritz will finish with 9 touchdowns in his career, but ultimately Eric Ebron is about as easy of a pick as you can get here, especially considering the fact that in those mid-2000s, especially his final year on campus in 2013, he was the dominant receiver for the Tar Heels, not only just as a tight end, but in the overall offense.
Yeah, he was one of the rare guys that when your go-to guy to throw the football to was your tight end. That was Eric Ebron in that 2013 year, and he was, I guess, up to the challenge because his production was always there. Mm-hmm. And you remember he had the one-handed catch at Georgia Tech in that year.
That's right.
Had a big-time game against Miami on Zero Dark Thursday that year. So it seemed like the bigger the game, he kind of rose to the occasion. And, he played well enough to be a top 10 pick in the NFL as a tight end at a position that you don't really see that in the first round anymore these days. And he's gone on to have a pretty successful pro career. But he was always a lot of fun to watch how Larry Fedora used him in the offense because they schemed every week different ways to find him the football, which is unique for a tight end.
Yeah, we have not seen a tight end since he's been on campus that's been used quite that same way because not only could you use him as an inline tight end, he was able to, handle his own blocking wise. But, you could split him out and use him as your slot receiver because he could find separation. And, you talked about, how big it was for Marquise Williams when he stepped in and led the Tar Heels in 2013 to a great finish down the stretch. Part of the reason that he was able to do that was because of Eric Ebron. That was his favorite target down the stretch. That was the guy that he was most comfortable going to. And you can see why. I don't, most of the other ones, if we bring up any of the guys that are behind, the guys on the list, the second and third team guys, we'll bring them up because we think there's a competition. This one, there's no competition. I just wanted to bring up the names at this position that I had on the second and third team. Jack Tabb is my second team tight end.
It was a linebacker.
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, he alternated with both before basically just eventually settling at tight end. Did some good things, had over 500 yards receiving in his career. And then the other guy that I put on the list was Brandon Fritz. But, I mean, that shows you how thinly used the tight end was for Carolina outside of when Eric Ebron was there. And, I don't know if it's going to change that much under Phil Longo. I don't think it will, honestly, because he didn't use his tight ends a ton when he was at Ole Miss. He used them a little bit more than they were used this year. But it really just shows the amount of drop off at that position when you look at Ebron compared to everybody else.
Oh, yeah, no, you're exactly right. You want to talk about dominant at a position, that was him. And, I mean, we're still kind of trying to find that kind of met, because the thing about him was he was a matchup problem for tight ends in the middle of the field. There are not many tight ends that could match his physicality. You're not going to bring a safety in the slot to cover a tight end, right? So, that was the thing about him was, it just opened up other parts of your offense.
Right, and we didn't have these Isaiah Simmons and all these athletic linebackers that are pretty much just safeties playing linebacker at the time. So he was able to take advantage of it. Let's get to your spot in the trenches on the offense. We'll start on with the offensive line. Look, I'm going to just kind of go from most obvious to then maybe some of the debatable ones. Jonathan Cooper's no-brainer, absolutely no-brainer. I know that his career started in 2008. He redshirted that year, then was a redshirt freshman in 2009. So pretty much the bulk of what he did was in the early part of this decade. Look, a guy that was an early first-round draft pick, top 10 draft pick, and rightfully so. He was about as good as it got on the offensive line. There's a reason why he was a unanimous first-team All-ACC and All-American in 2012, and that's just one that to me doesn't seem like there's much debate. The other one that doesn't seem like there's any debate at all is Landon Turner. Landon Turner, I don't think people realize how good he really was. Just because I think, the rest of the offensive line, they weren't flashy names. Like Jonathan Cooper's a name that's in the Ring of Honor. Landon Turner, I think, should eventually be in there, but because he wasn't quite as heralded as Cooper, wasn't a first-team All-American, he's just really not talked about. But, this is a guy that earned third-team All-ACC honors in his junior year, and then got first-team All-ACC and All-American honors in his final season on campus. Now, only one publication listed him as a first-team All-American, but this was a guy that was just dominant from the word go when he got on campus, and really, made a name for himself. Although he didn't get drafted in the NFL draft, still a guy that really is. I'm not going to compare him to Jonathan Cooper, but is still a guy that should definitely, without a doubt, be on this list.
As I was yawning as you were talking, yeah, no, you're exactly right. Cooper, no debate. You go top 10, you're going to be on an all-decade team. He hasn't had the kind of NFL career that he expected to have, but a lot of that was because of injuries.
Pretty much.
But it was a big part. He joined my Dallas Cowboys a few years ago and provided some much-needed offensive line depth at the time. That was just a guy that just mauled people and was just very good in both the run blocking and the pass blocking.
Extremely athletic.
Yeah, that was the thing that made him, because he could get lateral, he could pull and all that kind of stuff. Paved a lot of way for all those yards Giovanni Bernard racked up in his time on campus. Mm-hmm. And then Landon Turner, Everything you just said is exactly right. Also, is the kind of guy that started the "I got your back" mantra for that team in 2015.
One of the biggest leaders of that middle of the Fedora era. Without a doubt.
His production was there, but his leadership, I think, was more valued for that. Still can't believe that a guy that was a first-team All-ACC and an All-American goes undrafted. But
I don't get that.
That's the NFL world that we live in today, but a quality offensive lineman and a better person off the field for Carolina.
So the offensive tackles, James Hurst, I think, was kind of one of those guys that you had to put on there. I put him in the offensive line tier rankings that I did earlier this year, and he was pretty much a shoe. And everybody, of course, will remember when he went head-to-head with Jadeveon Clowney and got the best of him, but really was just a dominant force, when he started back in 2010, earned freshman All-American honors, and followed that with 3 straight appearances on all ACC teams, including back-to-back first-team honors to close his career. Was never recognized on the national stage, but really one of those guys that just was everything that Carolina needed him to be at tackle, protecting the blind side for, a guy that, got up there in a lot of the rankings in Bryn Renner, and then did it a little bit late in his career for Marquise Williams as well. The other guy, we'll leave him. Why don't we just talk a little bit about Hurst real quick? Because the other two I feel like are really, there's some debate that you could do there.
Yeah, with Hurst, he probably would have been on a lot more teams in terms of where the All-ACC if Carolina would have won more.
Right.
Because whenever you see people fill out their All-ACC or their All-Conference ballots, you look at the offensive linemen, they're pretty much from the teams that won a lot of games. Because that's the one position that no one really watches when they're at football games. Everyone's watching the quarterback and the running back and the skill guys.
Well, they have the football, yeah. The offensive linemen usually don't, so your focus is elsewhere.
But this was a guy that, like you said, went one-on-one with Jadeveon Clowney, held his own against, at the time, the front runner to win the Heisman Trophy that year, and was just a solid tackle, tackle, and then has gone on to have a very good career in the NFL. So, yeah, I mean, what are you going to say?
Won a Super Bowl ring with the Baltimore Ravens as well. So this is a guy that it carried over with him. You knew from the minute. Look, if you're on the field as a tackle in your freshman year,
you're doing something right.
You're doing something right. You made a real good impression, and that's exactly what he did, and is one of those guys that you would kill to have on an offensive line. Especially, can you imagine if him and Charlie Heck were on the same offensive line together? There would be nobody getting after Sam Howell. And so we talk about Charlie Heck. I had the debate between him and his brother John at right tackle. I think you could maybe make a case for Bentley Spain, but I feel like it's Charlie and John. I went with John just because he, received more of the All-ACC honors, receiving All-ACC honors in both of his final 2 years on campus, started 50 career games along the offensive line, which was just a couple more than Charlie. But, look, these two brothers, but also both of them just really, really good offensive linemen. And I feel for Charlie because I feel like he kind of got duped the last couple of years because he's been a really good offensive lineman for the Tigers.
I'd probably lean Charlie because think about whenever he wasn't available to play. We were scared to death.
That's a good point.
Could we keep our quarterback upright?
Well, that's the what does MVP mean type of debate. More valuable or better player? I don't know because these two are both very, very good players.
That's why I would go him because whenever he wasn't on the field, I was a lot more worried about is my quarterback going to make it through the game,
right? As
opposed to John. But yeah, no, both guys, hell of football players. And you got to think Charlie came in as a tight end and then converted to play tackle. Kind of shows you the versatility he has as a football player. And we expect him to have a pretty career in the NFL. I'd love for my team to draft him or,
right.
A lot of teams that need offensive line play. So.
Well, and we'll probably discuss it at some point when we start doing some of the draft podcasts. When we get closer to the NFL draft with our guys, we'll kind of break him down for you. Charlie Heck, look, he does one thing and one thing great, and that is pass protect.
Yeah.
And guess what you need to do at the NFL level with where the game's at today? pass protect. He can run block as well. I think John was probably a little bit of a better run blocker than him. But, I mean, look, you can compare them back and forth. Charlie is one of those guys that just was a workhorse from his first opportunity on the field. So that's where I went with that. And then at center, I had the debate between Lucas Crowley and Russell Bodine. Russell Bodine, of course, did get drafted, left a year early. If he would have came back, I feel like he probably would have been able to get drafted a little bit higher even. I went with Crowley, though, because he started 41 games at Carolina and closed out his career with third and second team All-ACC honors in his final 2 years, whereas Russell Bodine, if I remember correctly, didn't even get an honorable mention anywhere. Another tough one, but I went with the guy that had a little more experience on campus of the two of them.
Yeah, I'd lean Crowley, too. Also, what a good name for an offensive lineman. I don't know. It just kind of always,
Lucas Crowley.
That just seems like a guy that, I'm going to come and I'm going to maul your ass for 3 hours on a Saturday in
That's
Keenan
what he did,
Stadium.
yeah. Three years as the starter at center. So.
Look, but both guys, good quality players, but Crowley, clearly, I don't think it was much of a debate there.
Okay. So then you go to the defensive line, and look, for a unit that's always kind of been the bread and butter for Carolina, really out of any unit on the entire team. This is, you see the debates. Is Carolina D-line you? If you go back through the history, you can make the argument. I don't know if they quite lived up to that type of mantra during this decade, but you look at some of the guys that came through, really, really good players, guys that will be mentioned among Carolina lore, but maybe aren't quite as high up as some of the guys in the 2000s or in the decade prior in the 1990s when Mac Brown was first there. But, I mean, look, you got Quentin Coples. The guy came in, was dominant. I know that his career began in 2008, but his last 2 seasons on campus were just unbelievable. He landed first-team All-ACC honors in both of those seasons. It's a guy that had over 15 tackles for loss and 7 sacks in both of those years. Hard to leave him off the list. Went as a first-round draft pick, of course. Didn't really pan out at the NFL level, but that's one of those guys that, when I look back on it, I really wish he did pan out because he was really good when he was at Carolina early on under Butch Davis and then under Everett Withers in his final season. And then Kareem Martin, no real debate there either. Another guy that was just dominant, of course, was, dominated through from his sophomore year on, but really took off his senior year when he had 21.5 tackles for loss and 11.5 sacks to earn first-team All-ACC honors. And then the other guy that I put on there that I don't think anybody can debate is Sylvester Williams. There 2 years as a JUCO transfer and did just about anything you could want out of your defensive tackle. Finished with 20.5 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks. So he could do both. He could stop the run. He could get after the quarterback. And really, once you saw Quentin Coples leave campus, there was a time where, Kareem Martin was dominant, but Sylvester Williams was probably your best defensive lineman. So that run, just those 3 guys that were sandwiched in there between the Butch Davis final season, Everett Withers era, and then the early Larry Fedora era. Just a phenomenal group right there, those 3.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Coples was a guy that was hard to block off the edge and pass blocking, but also played the run very well. Mm-hmm. Kareem Martin, that senior year was just dominant. And, he was doing stuff that, when we say Ndamukong Suh, in terms of tackles for loss, that's how good he was that senior year. Think back to Ndamukong Suh went to the Heisman Trophy presentation that one year because of how dominant he was there at Nebraska. And then Sly, great story, but was also a big part of that Carolina defense that was in transition from the Butch Davis era to the Larry Fedora era. He was the one guy that you could probably count on to show up and make some plays. Got a Super Bowl ring with the Broncos. So those are the kinds of people that whenever you want to make the argument for D-line university, it's not Julius Peppers or whatever. It's the other guys that
it's your depth guys. Yeah. You say, look at this guy, look at his numbers, and you're like, wow, that's pretty good.
And like you said, Coples was a first-round pick, didn't pan out for him. But I mean, the talent was definitely there. So I mean, that's the thing.
Right.
Carolina's never lacked talent on the defensive front.
Oh, they're always going to have talent down there, and it even extends to the guy that I have as the last first team member here. I went with Aaron Crawford. I know that the accolades aren't going to be there, and I think the debate is between him and Nazir Jones. Part of the reason that I went with Crawford here is because you kind of need a nose tackle. Sly wasn't really a nose tackle. He was more that three-technique defensive tackle who could work well against guards. He never really struggled against centers because he was always faster than him, but he wasn't a guy that you would think would fit great in the middle of your defense, where Crawford is. And, I mean, look, here's the other thing about Aaron Crawford. He was as dominant of a run defender as you're going to see. This past year, his senior year, he was the best interior defensive lineman against the run in the country, according to Pro Football Focus. And if you want to say that Pro Football Focus is BS, you can. It's widely regarded amongst everyone throughout the football world. There are some that still doubt it, but for the most part, there's a lot of people that roll off of that, especially when you look and see how you grade offensive and defensive linemen. So I went with Crawford. I mean, he finished his career with 128 total tackles, 15 tackles for loss, and 7 sacks. But the other thing that you got to look at with him, if he doesn't get injured last year in 2018, those numbers are probably a lot better.
Yeah, no, you make a pretty good argument for him to be that fourth guy. And the injury, like you said, slowed down some of his statistic. He's also, I mean, look at Carolina this year whenever he wasn't on the field, and look at when he
not the same. Yeah,
he was just a guy that was just when he's on the field, stuff happens in a good way, because, and like you said, as good a run defender as you're going to find in the country. Mm-hmm. I mean, he graded out as that.
Yeah,
and so whatever you want to believe in that, you do whatever you want. But whenever he was on the field, Carolina's defense was better for it.
Oh, definitely.
Whether it was under Larry Fedora or under Mac Brown, I mean, he at least gave you a chance to make some plays. So.
Right, and I mean, Nazir Jones, a good career, but really took some time to sort of develop into what he eventually became. And then defensive tackle was the position that I just had the most trouble with going back through, because when you look at some of the names, it's pretty thin. I actually listed Jason Strobridge as a defensive tackle just because I didn't really know who else I was going to pull if I didn't put him as a defensive tackle, and I thought he was serviceable enough there. I mean, look at our third team guys, and I love pointing these guys out because, look, these aren't the sexy guys that everybody's going to remember and going to say, oh, they were phenomenal players, but they deserve recognition. Justin Thomason, a guy that, if you're a real diehard Tar Heel fan, you remember him, came in 2013 really as a rotational guy and became a big part of that team, especially his final 2 years in 2014 and then in the big season in 15. He was the guy, remember, right next to Nazir Jones, and put up some pretty solid numbers. And then Ethan Farmer, 2010 to 2014, really just a big space eater guy. Took up a lot of space, a good run defender, and is another one that just won't get the type of credit that he deserves. Some of the other guys, I wanted to point these guys out at defensive end. Malik Carney, a fantastic career. One of those guys that just kind of got swept under the rug because he played, his final 2 seasons were just not good years for Carolina, and he played during a time where the defense was never really that good. The best that defense ever was in 2014, and that unit still wasn't that good. So, and then Norkeithus Otis, another guy that really jumped off the page his junior year, had a huge season, 18.5 tackles for loss and 6.5 sacks, came out and just wasn't able to really duplicate that in his final season, had huge expectations in 14, didn't really have the type of season we thought, but still a very solid defensive end. So those are the guys we went with there. Now we move on to linebacker. 2 guys that are no-brainers here, in my opinion. Kevin Reddick, my stupid rear end in the offseason did not put him on the linebacker tiers list. Why I did not put him on there, I cannot begin to fathom, because that is one of my favorite linebackers that they've had at Carolina. I loved Bruce Carter. I loved Quan Sturdivant. I loved Zach Brown. Kevin Reddick was my favorite of the group, because I don't really know why. It was just something about him. Whenever he got an opportunity, he made the most. Because you got to remember, when he first got there, he was behind all 3 of those guys. And rightfully so, because Bruce Carter and Zach Brown, as well as Quan Sturdivant, all three of them were established. He had to come in and kind of pick his way through. Started his career in 2009, and, his final 3 seasons, the best of his career, all took place at the start of the decade, though. That's why he's on the list and make him a worthy candidate to be here. His senior season alone, he finished with 85 total tackles, 18 and a half tackles for loss out of the middle linebacker spot, and 6.5 sacks, and deserved a first-team honor in the ACC, and did. I don't think there's any doubt that he should be on there. The other guy that there's no debate is Cole Holcomb. Led the team in tackles his final 3 seasons on campus, started his career at Carolina as a walk-on, and went on to get selected in the NFL draft late in the 5th round. Now is a guy that is starting in Washington. Really one of those guys, we always talk about, guys on the basketball program like Luke May, who just put in the work that they had to put in. Weren't the guy that everybody was talking about when they came in. He's a gym rat.
Film junkie.
There you go. And that is exactly what Cole Holcomb was. Finished his career with 327 total tackles and earned second-team All-ACC honors as a senior. Honestly, probably would have been first team if Carolina was a little bit better in his final season, which was 2018, a year ago, when they won just 2 games. But those two, to me, are non-debatable. I think they have to be on this list, especially with some of the other names that are behind them. I think you got to go with both of those guys.
Yeah, no. I think we forget about Reddick because we had all the 3 guys that you mentioned before them. Did not know that he was your favorite linebacker in Carolina football history.
It's something about him, man. Well, okay, I'll say this. Carolina football history, from what I have watched, since I've been watching in depth. Yes.
I still thought it was Bruce Carter because that's my guy.
Oh, I love Bruce. Believe me, I love Bruce. But
and then Holcomb, yeah. I mean, to come on from a walk-on and then to do all that stuff that he did and was the only player we had defensively the last couple of years because, I mean, he was going to – as sure as the tacklers we had at the linebacking spot.
Had to cover in space, too. I mean, he was a guy that they played out of position so many times.
Yeah, pretty
it was
much.
Unbelievable. They just threw him out there.
He just shrugged his shoulders, went and made football plays. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to argue with those two. And Holcomb, like you said, in the NFL with the Redskins, now was a starter towards the end of that year for Washington. So it's really translated for him over to the NFL level. And the linebacking core, it took a dip in this decade as it was the year before, but there were still quality guys that we got to see.
Right, and so that leads to the third guy. And so there was, I had to go over this for a minute. Zach Brown played a little bit in this era, but 2010 he had an injury that just limited his production, and 2011 he had a big year. He had one big year. So how do you compare that with the rest of the guys in the decade was kind of the question to me. So the guys that I went with, Andre Smith was a guy that you had to talk about. But again, you want to talk about a guy that struggled with injuries. That's kind of what derailed him. That 17 season, that was what cost him. If he plays that whole 17 season, I think this is more of a conversation. Of course, goes to the NFL early after that, but his first 2 years on campus became a key part of that 2015 defense. Again, that was a defense that still struggled, but became a key part of that group. And then in 16 was really the guy in that linebacking core for the Tar Heels because Cole Holcomb was there but was still kind of taking some time to evolve into what he was. And then the other guy, I had Shaq Rashad up there, but the problem with Shaquille Rashad, if you go back and look, his senior year was as dominant as it gets. 126 tackles, double-digit tackles for loss, and up there in sacks. The biggest issue for him was when you talk about a guy that literally had 1 year, he had 1 year. Before that, he did not have a season where he had more than 30 tackles in a season. So he was a guy that jumped on the scene for that 1 year, was phenomenal, but really didn't do a whole lot the rest of his time on campus, unfortunately. Again, we still love Shaq. He's the guy that likes to come out before every game and say we're going to win by 30. The optimism is fantastic. He's also one of the best personalities ever, and he does like Justin Bieber. That's probably the reason he's not on the list, right? Like,
I mean, I was going to put him on the list for his Twitter account.
There we go.
Because I mean,
it is true. He also was one of the main people that got behind creating the 10 God shirt that we had for Mitch Trubisky in 2016. the one that was Mitch Trubisky but wasn't a Mitch Trubisky shirt from Barstool Sports.
Yeah,
so.
we both actually own that T-shirt.
We do.
As a matter of fact.
I am not wearing that shirt today. I'm disappointed in myself.
But yeah, I mean the third spot, I completely was tuned out. Who you said after we talked about Zach Brown.
Okay, I hadn't. Okay, so I haven't listed the guy that I put on there yet. But Zach Brown, because you had the 1 year, but how does that stack up against everybody else? So I said Andre Smith, because you had the 2 really good years. You have to take into account the injury, because you would think that if he doesn't get injured against Louisville, he was going to have a huge year, because it was him, Cole Holcomb, Donnie Miles, and MJ Stewart, and that was pretty much it on that team. So, I mean, who else are you gonna put up there? I mean, I got some guys on the third team, Cason Collins, who had a sneaky good career, Travis Hughes, who we loved but really wasn't all that productive, and then my other guy on the third team, Chaz Surratt, who had 1 year. I mean, we can't. Where
is Jeff Schottmer on this list?
Jeff Schottmer is the guy that is my pick at linebacker. That's who I went with. I wanted to kind of throw all the other names out there and then finish with the guy I went with, which was Schottmer. Look, never led the team in tackles, but really that was just because he had a lot of guys around him that were really talented. I mean, look, Donnie Miles had 128 tackles in his senior year. He was not going to catch Donnie Miles. That is a huge number for Donnie, as well as you had Shaquille Rashad, who had 126 tackles that year. But really just a very solid player in the middle of the defense, 279 total tackles in his career, 19 tackles for loss. One of the biggest things about Schottmer that we will always remember is, yeah, he played middle linebacker, but he came in as a converted safety, which to then play middle linebacker is amazing. To go from a safety to a middle linebacker, first of all, you got to put on a lot of weight, and that's a lot of responsibility that you've got to have. But he was also just great in coverage. He had 4 interceptions in his career, and 2 of them he took back for touchdowns, both coming in the 2014 season. So I went with Jeff Schottmer, but, he's one of those guys that if, in any other era, he's probably a guy that lands on a third team, maybe doesn't even get mentioned. It's just the era at linebacker for the Tar Heels was really, really thin with talent, but still, I mean, Jeff Schottmer is a guy that deserves recognition, because while he may not have been great, he was still very solid.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I thought the answer was going to be here. Like you said, as good a coverage linebacker as Carolina has had. He made up for his run deficiency for being able to make plays in the passing game. Also, another was a guy that was a walk-on, JUCO transfer, one of the two.
Former walk-on. Yep.
And just one of the hidden gems that Larry Fedora was able to find, and was a big part of that 2015 defense. And, the hair. That's you can't talk about him without
all
the
hair team. He's definitely up there along with, Tommy Bancroft, Caleb Presley when he had the long hair as the quarterback. That takes a lot to pull off. We've seen that here since. Now, are we putting him up there with Trevor Lawrence and your guy out in Hawaii, old Cole McDonald?
Look, it's up there. Now he's got a shaved head. It's completely it's a completely different 180. But that was one of the guys that I loved watching, and maybe it was you got to hear the announcers mess his name up every week.
Our boy Nick Dorman, who is a Clemson fan that we have been friends with for a while now, he used to call him Jeff Scoopmer.
Yeah. But that also kind of shows you that that him being on the list shows you where the production drops off at the linebacker spot.
I don't want to, I think I sounded like I was a guy that really was kind of knocking on Schottmer a lot. You want to talk about one of the hardest working guys during this decade. It was definitely Jeff Schottmer. To go from a walk-on at safety and come in and play middle linebacker for 3 years in the middle of that defense, it took a lot. So you got to hand it to him. We'll move to the defensive backs. Again, there are some no-brainers here. There's one at safety, one at corner that I went with. Trey Boston, no doubt in my mind. Came in as a corner, moved to safety his senior year. Now, of course, is at safety in the NFL, but, he was a do-it-all type of guy. finished with at least 70 tackles and 3 interceptions in each of his final 3 seasons, and earned honorable mention and second-team All-ACC honors in his final 2 seasons on campus. Had 13 interceptions, the most of any Tar Heel in the decade, and was really just dominant. The other guy that has to be on this list is MJ Stewart. Was as good of a lockdown corner as you're going to find for Carolina. Also played the nickelback position so well. I mean, pretty much. Remember, we were still kind of in the little hangover from when Vic Koenig was there and wanted to play the 4-2-5 defense. We were saying, man, we never want to see nickel again. And MJ Stewart kind of changed our minds on that because he was so good as a run defender. Finished with 199 total tackles, 11.5 tackles for loss, 6 interceptions, and more importantly, the most pass deflections by a mile in the decade, with 41 in his career. He was as good as it got at cornerback. You were not throwing the football on either Trey Boston or MJ Stewart.
Yeah, no, those two names you can't argue with. And you think about MJ, a lot of times he was put on an island and he just made play after play after play. I mean, it was a first-round pick, or it was second-round pick.
Second round,
of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and was really, like you said, after we got done with Vic Koenig, we were done with nickel defense, and then we brought it back with him. So,
right, and then Trey Boston, I mean, to move from because there were a couple of guys that did it. He was the first that played corner for 3 years. They had a void at safety, and they told him, okay, we're going to move you to safety, and he did it with seamless transition. Actually played better at safety than he had played at corner.
That's what I thought when the transition happened. I mean, now it paved him a way to have a career in the NFL. So,
although I thought he could have had a career because he was a good coverage corner, and that's the thing that was so great about him is he could play both positions. So if you needed to tell him, like we saw so often this year, with all the injuries that we had, Miles Dorn had to play one-on-one coverage. Trey Boston could play one-on-one coverage with ease. He's like, yeah, I used to be a corner, so this is not difficult for me. So, yeah, those were the two guys that I had as shoe-ins. The other positions were a decent debate. I think let's go with corner because I went with Tim Scott. I think that was pretty close with him and Des Lawrence, who I think you're going to go with because you were a Des Lawrence guy for sure. That was your guy. But, I mean, you look at with Tim Scott, finished his career with 218 total tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, 8 interceptions, 16 pass deflections. I went with them because he was a little more of a playmaker on the ball. He had more interceptions than Lawrence did. But another one of those guys that had to move to safety his final year. Did a really good job, led the team in tackles his senior year on campus in 2014, and just one of those versatile guys that I thought fit there. And then the other position that you had some debate at was safety. I went with Donnie Miles it kind of shaped out. Sam Smiley, really good career, actually was a 3-year guy. I didn't really realize that until you went back. Really had 3 productive years on campus. Dominique Green at safety, another guy who, surprisingly was a guy that took the ball away maybe more than you realized. And then, of course, Miles Dorn, I had him on the third team, or Denoris Searcy, who had literally 1 year. He was there 2007 to 2010, so he was a 1-year guy. That's hard to put him up there. So I went with Donnie Miles because, I mean, look, he didn't finish with all ACC honors ever. I don't know how. That makes absolutely no sense. But he had consecutive seasons of over 100 total tackles out of the safety position. Definition of an in-the-box type of guy. As I mentioned, led the team in tackles in 2015 with 128 and did finish his career with 320 tackles and 9.5 for a loss. So I went with Donnie Miles and Tim Scott. Do you agree with me there, or do you want to sub one or both of those guys out?
I'd put Des Lawrence in there over Tim Scott. Like I said, I was a big fan of D-Law. He was a big part of that defensive success that we experienced under Gene Chizik. Really benefited from bringing Gene Chizik in. It really helped his technical part of his game. I was really a big fan of his length at corner. And then Donnie Miles, man, that guy that guy made every tackle on the field because normally the 10 guys in front of him didn't make tackles.
Pretty much.
But, as good of a safety in the run game as we've seen.
Yeah, it wasn't if you can go back and look at his statistics, he had 5 pass deflections his entire career. Wasn't used that much at all in pass coverage. But, yeah, there is nobody that we've seen at Carolina that is a better run tackler out of the safety position.
Right.
At least since we've been watching. Now, I think a couple of guys that deserve to be pointed out at corner, Jabari Price. Now, when you went back and looked, I went back and looked at his stats, and, I had to put him behind. I couldn't include him in that debate between Lawrence and Tim Scott. Really good player, but just really didn't have the statistics. I know you'll love this on the third team. I went with Charles Brown as one of my third team
That's
guys.
My guy.
He was, of course, suspended for most of the 2010 season because of the NCAA issues, but did come back in that 2011 season, had one big year. That's the reason he's not higher. And then I went with Patrice Renee as my other third team guy. Really a guy that, came in, started the first game of his career, actually, against Georgia, disappeared, but came back late in the 2017 season, produced well enough. 2018 had the best year of his career, phenomenal, and then was set up to have a phenomenal year this year. He'll be back, of course, this next year in 2020, but I think he's a guy that deserves to be up there as well. Some really good corners, but we'll go with those guys. So then special teams, we won't go too in-depth here because I went full nerd and decided to go with deep snappers and holders as well to go just to point out some other guys. But I think, kick returner and punt returner, I don't care if you think there's a debate. You're not allowed to think there's a debate because TJ Logan, 5 career kickoff returns for touchdowns, averaged 27.2 yards per kick return, which is a Tar Heel record by a mile. That at least since they've started recording punt return and kick return statistics. And then the other guy, Ryan Switzer, there is literally no debate on this one. He could have won it even if he retired after his freshman season, where he did set an NCAA record for return yard average in that season with 20.9 and tied the NCAA record with 5 punt return touchdowns in his first year on campus. Finished his career with a beautiful 10.9 yards per punt return average and 7 career touchdowns. Those two are non-debatable. The other guys, a little more debatable. Casey Barth, I went with him because he had the first 2 years on campus, very successful in 08 and 09. Of course, came back in 2010 to start the decade as a junior. Got injured in 2011 and got the red shirt to come back in 2012. In the decade, finished 35 of 42 on field goal attempts, so very efficient. So I went with him, and then at punter, I went with Tommy Hibbert over Tom Sheldon. The averages were pretty close, but I think Hibbert just a little more consistent, also stayed there a year longer than Tom Sheldon, so I decided to go with those two guys. Do you have, or are you going to go with anybody else at either of those two positions? Because there are cases to be made. Nick Weiler has a really interesting case.
The thing with Weiler was
struggled his first year.
We started with the guy that outside of 35 yards, we could kick field goals.
Right. And final 2 years, pretty good. Not as efficient as Barth is why I went with Barth, but still really came back after when we remember when he used to come on the field and we were like, oh, no, please, no.
I think he's got to be there not only for the kick he made at Florida State,
right.
The celebration alone just is worthy of being
and by the way, nickname as well, Field Goal Jesus.
Yeah,
come on. He has to be in the debate.
So that's probably the only thing I change.
Really?
You're not taking Logan or Switzer out of their return spots. That was a total get off my lawn moment from you, by the way, but you're not allowed.
Oh, you're not allowed. No. I'm sorry. There's nobody else that is going to fit up that. You could maybe make an argument at kick returner for Ratliff Williams, but Logan was just on a different level.
And then punter, I'd go Hibbert just because he punted more. So
yeah, I mean, Tom Sheldon, extremely efficient. Remember, what was it, his first year on campus in 2016? I think he allowed 3 return yards the whole year. So, I mean, you want to talk about a guy that was just a weapon. I went with him, and then, I mean, you get into some of the deeper guys in the third team. I mean, kickers and punters, if you got really good ones, they're going to stay around for a while. So, I mean, we had guys like Freeman Jones on there and on the third team, as well as Hunter Lent. So, some interesting guys there. And then you guys, of course, can go on and check out the article, which will go a little more in depth. So we discussed a lot of the guys, but there's still a lot of guys that you can go and look. All of the position groups, you have a first, second, and third team. The first team, we go in depth on why we picked the guys. The second and third team, it'll just be the names, but you can go there and look. It's a nice trip down memory lane. And the all-decade team, a really fun thing that we were able to do. Those are both going to be up on the website when this podcast is out, so make sure that you check that one out, as well as the basketball edition, where we have the starting 5 and some honorable mentions at the bottom of that article. You guys will really like that walk down memory lane. Some guys that may not always be talked about in the upper echelon when you go back and talk about the history of the respective sports at Carolina, but guys that definitely deserve recognition for what they did in this decade. So that's going to do it for this edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast. Of course, we want you guys to go back, check out the recap of the game against Temple. We have coming up the that's going to be an article. We have the awards coming up that we're going to do for the 2019 season. Take a look back at our standouts that we projected before the season and how those finished up. And we'll do that coming up later this week. And then, of course, we'll be circling back around into off-season mode, which we've done the past few years. Going to have some interviews in the offseason that we're going to do, some really fun topics that we're going to bring up, and of course we'll be keeping you up to date on everything going on the recruiting trail as we head towards February signing period, which seems like it's going to be a pretty quiet one, 2021 trail, as well as stuff going on with the NFL draft, guys entering the transfer portal, and everything like that. One bit of news that I did want to slip in there in case you guys did miss it. I got an article online about it. Carl Tucker and Greg Ross both officially in the transfer portal. We knew Greg Ross was going to be in the transfer portal, really just kind of signified by the fact that he was out there on senior day. He is going to go as a graduate transfer, so there was a chance that he could walk away from football, but he's going to try to play football somewhere else as a graduate transfer. And Carl Tucker got an extra year of eligibility, but is deciding to go elsewhere. That probably in large part due to the fact that Garrett Walston took over the starting job late in the season, and Carolina brought in 3 tight ends in this recruiting class, depending on what happens with Jefferson Boaz. So there is going to be a lot of depth at the position. Carl feels that it's best to move on. And I think, honestly, what he's probably going to do, he might take the chance to go and play with his brother at Elon, as he just signed with the Phoenix during the early signing period. So that could be pretty cool. We wish them both the best. And, of course, we'll keep you covered on anything else that happens with that. You can check that all out on HeelToughBlog.com. We have all the articles up there for you. Go back, look at the recap article from the game against Temple, as well as the stock report from Bowl Week, and that's right, the Trench Report, the final one of the season, written by the guy you just heard from. So make sure you go on there, check out those articles, keep up to date on everything that we've got going on. Make sure that you subscribe to the newsletter at the bottom of the page. Put your email down there. That'll subscribe you to it. Or make sure that you are following the Twitter page at Heel Tough Blog on Twitter, or my account at Future Tariel, Josh's account at Joshua Marlowe 5, and then, of course, the Facebook account. That's the most crucial one. Make sure you like and follow the Facebook account on Facebook at facebook.com/HeelToughBlog. We are kind of getting restricted in some of those groups that we're trying to post. I know a lot of people like seeing it in the groups, but unfortunately Facebook's got some rules that they are really trying to hammer down on our accounts. So the best way to do it, make sure that you like the page so that you will be able to see everything. It'll pop right up on your timeline and you'll get a notification whenever we post. So make sure that you guys check that out. That's the best way to keep up with everything. Best way to keep up with the podcast. You can subscribe to those on any of your major podcasting sites. So of course, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, iHeartRadio, any of those sites, you can do that. And we also want you to rate, review, and then subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a nice little rating. Give us a little review down there. We'd really appreciate that from you guys. You've been listening for so long. We want to improve if there's any way we can. And, of course, we're always looking to get you guys involved as well. So make sure that you guys go ahead and do that for us. We greatly appreciate it. So I want to thank you guys for listening to this edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast. And as always, go Tar Heels.
Talk to you next year.